LDComics is a women-led welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeton as Ladies Do Comics, today LDComics is run by a committee of published graphic novelists: Rachel Ball, Emma Burleigh, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeton. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leela Corman. I am a cartoonist and painter and teacher. My last graphic novel was Victory Parade. It came out in 2024. I don't actually know if it's out in the UK. I assume it is. I don't know for sure. Maybe someone can tell me. Um, so I started out, I actually trained initially as a painter, and then I kind of bounced around art school doing different things. I studied printmaking, I studied performance art briefly, because everybody studied performance art in the 90s. Um, and then I kind of I landed on illustration as a major, kind of out of frustration, like I have to figure out how to get paid to draw pictures. I don't know how to do it any other way. But I was already making comics at that point, so I was self-publishing mini comics and trying to figure out, how do I get my work seen? How do I get into the stream that I see of underground comics in at that time, 90s era United States. So uh, I managed to do that and have a parallel career as an illustrator for a long time. I no longer work as an illustrator, and I'm happy to answer questions about why, if anyone wants to know. Otherwise, we could just move on from that. But I made a couple of big, heavily researched graphic novels that were they're literally graphic novels, they're fiction. And this is a semantic hill that I'm going to die on. A graphic novel is a work of fiction in graphic form. And if it's nonfiction, it's not a novel. And I don't like to let book critics and others get away with calling it a graphic novel, like Joe Sacco's Palestine. Nonfiction, not a novel. Anyway, having said that, I made two distinctly fictional, very heavily researched graphic novels set in New York City at different times. The first one was called Unterzakhn, and it was about the Lower East Side kind of Jewish immigrant community, and specifically a pair of twin sisters whose lives take kind of divergent paths, and yet I think rather connected. My second book was called Victory Parade, like I said, came out last year, and it was set in the 1940s during the Second World War at a time when women were working in a lot of wartime industries. And so I was interested in that, and I was also interested in a lot of other things that happened at the time. Um, and then after I delivered Victory Parade, I suddenly started painting again. And I'm certainly happy to talk about how that happened, but I thought that I would show some comics pages and then what I'm working on now. So I'm going to share my screen, and it's going to be a little bit awkward for a second um, because there's just no way around it. I'm sorry. Um, so here are some pages from Victory Parade. As you may have guessed, there is a women's wrestling subplot. Um, I was very interested in the sort of in between experiences of the dream state and the death state in this book. And as I was working, I started to realize that I was making a book about individuals processing collective trauma. And as I was working on this, it became very obvious that, of course, we are all globally processing ongoing rolling collective trauma. So I spent a lot of the pandemic working on this book, but I started before that. Um, this book for me was also a form of anti-fascist activism. It was what I felt I could do at the time when I began it at the end of 2016. Events have a way of getting away from us, especially during long projects. And I definitely feel like I am in a different world now than the world that I was living in when I first made this book. But this is a book about a very enduring human experiences of loss, of absence, of distance, of trauma, and also of how people cope. So I'm showing you some pages that are dreams and kind of death hallucinations. I also had a running theme in this book of copying from Busby Berkeley choreographies. Busby Berkeley was a choreographer for film in the middle decades of the 20th century. I'm not a historian of early film, but he was working prior to the Hays Code in the US. And then he continued to make movies at least into the early 1950s. And some of you may be familiar with his choreographies for the swimming performer Esther Williams. But in this scene, this is a scene where a character is dying, and this is what she's seeing as she's dying. She's suddenly in a sort of a nightmarish version of the opening dance number of a Busby Berkeley film from 1943 called The Gang's All Here, which is it's in Technicolor. It's amazing. It stars Carmen Miranda, and so this is the Carmen Miranda opening number involves a lot of dancers holding gigantic bananas and Carmen Miranda playing a banana xylophone, among other things. There is a performing monkey, not a real monkey. This was the 1940s. And I was really interested in Busby Berkeley. I mean, I used to be a dancer and I really love the delirium of a 1940s dance musical, but also I realized as I was working on this too that there's a connection between the kind of choreographies that Berkeley was doing with large numbers of dancers in these mass formations. He was famous for the mass formations of dancers making these geometric forms shot from above, sometimes shot from below in the water. They're really incredible visually. But I realized also I was thinking a lot about massed bodies, massed graves, masses of soldiers, columns of dancers. Now, there's a very real part of the book that takes place in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is what it sounds like. It's a Navy Yard in Brooklyn. Um, and it is where a lot of working class women went to work building ships in New York City during the war. So I thought I would depict it as clearly as I could here. Um, but I also really couldn't stay away from the hallucinatory. And so for my wrestler character, she's a refugee, allegedly from Germany, but really a Polish Jew. Um, and I wanted to show some of her early life. And that quickly became yet another series of hallucinations. Or are they? Are they visions or are they really things that happened to her? Um, I'm going to conclude the comics portion of this momentarily by just showing you some of the covers of my books. Um, That's the original cover art for Victory Parade without any of the typography, just before scanning. And that's how it ended up looking. As I said, my previous books are Unterzakhn, and that's easy to find, I think. And this collection called You Are Not a Guest, which collects my short nonfiction comics. In between Victory Parade and Unterzakhn, I made a lot of nonfiction. So this is in the period between 2013 and 2022. So some of it is concurrent with my working on Victory Parade. I made a lot of short autobiographical works. And I'll show you a little bit of that as well, but what I'd like to do right now is talk about what I'm currently working on. So like I said, I went back to painting. And for the past year, I've been working on a series of drawings, kind of trying to do some kind of loose pen drawings without really thinking too much because I spent the last 15 years just thinking really, really hard about my work and doing really heavy research and working in this very meticulous, obsessive way. I basically became a painter of miniatures. And I wanted to get back to just an unfiltered, straightforward improvisational drawing practice in my sketchbook. I haven't had a sketchbook practice in years. Um, so I started translating some of these drawings into paintings. But what started to emerge in the drawings has been a sort of an excavation of memories of the subculture that I like to say the subculture that raised me, which was the kind of 90s era, 80s and 90s, but mostly 90s pre-internet subculture. So this is very analog. I'll go back to that in a second. Um, Kind of pre-digital life, no cell phones, no internet. Um, Really the couple of years before the World Wide Web came into existence as a public thing. I mean, it was a military technology for a long time prior to that, but civilians didn't have access to that. So in the world that I became an adult in the mid 1990s, rents were really cheap in big cities in the US. I was living in an incredible illegal apartment in downtown Boston that had a lot of weird and interesting features, possibly haunted, if you believe that sort of thing. Also just very, very illegal. Over 6 nightclubs. There was an alley next door that had 6 terrible nightclubs in it, and I would frequently come home and there would be like teeth and bloody rags in my doorway, and just phalanxes of drunk couples having very heterosexual drunk arguments with each other and stealing each other's taxis and stuff from Thursday night through Sunday night. Also, just living in a lot of kind of cheapo, falling apart New England buildings and having weird relationships, weird friendships. I was thinking about a lot of those things. I'll come back to the comics. Actually, I'm not, this is actually relevant. So, this is a very brief excerpt of a nonfiction comic I did, the last nonfiction comic I did. This ran on Bandcamp in their resonance column, which I'm not sure if that still exists. It was a place where people mostly were writing prose about records that were important to them. I pitched them a comic about a band called Come, who were a Boston band in the 1990s, fronted by somebody who I'm now friends with, but I did not know them at the time when I was 19. And so this is really about how music and art travels with you as you age, and what kind of like how it can stay significant and evolve along with you, and how we ourselves evolve as well as we age, and kind of viewing my younger self with a little more compassion. And that is relevant because that is kind of the world in which a lot of these fictional drawings and paintings are set. Um, so I'm still working with the hallucinatory a lot. It's really hard for me to take that out of my work. I'm not really super interested in straightforward, realistic scenes in my paintings most of the time, even though I really love painting directly from life. Um, so I am in the process of trying to figure out what happens to all of these things now and what's their relationship with comics. I'm thinking a lot about stories set in that time. And I will say, the thing that, I'll go back to this for a second. The thing that really instigated, the moment that really instigated this particular project, which has a title, it has a working title, which is The Same Fuck Earth. And I will explain the origin of that title in a moment. The origin of that was I was on a train home from a work engagement in Philadelphia, and I watched a documentary about a band called Slint. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that band, but they sort of invented math rock. They didn't mean to, but they did. Um, and as I was watching the documentary, it just brought back this flood of memories of that time period of places and times that looked like this, and the kind of sweet, unreliable musicians that I used to be friends with or sometimes date, beer-soaked parties on porches in the summer heat in Massachusetts, and kind of having, again, like I said earlier, strange relationships with people. Those unreliable boys were not always so sweet. Living in poorly insulated apartments where we had to put plastic over the windows. And I look, I don't know if this is something that you have to do in the UK, but uh, at least back in the day when a lot of the houses in New England were not well insulated and the windows were as old as the houses. These are like Victorian era houses. You would have to put plastic over the windows and then this special tape. And then if you were feeling hardworking, you would blow dry the plastic and it would kind of shrink wrap your windows for the winter. And it was awful. It was awful to have to do that. A lot of the time, people would just loosely put plastic on the windows. So I was thinking about those kinds of environments and the kind of people that I knew, like I said. So this was a particularly haunted drawing where I was in this one, I was late at night and I didn't have my contact lenses in. I had a stick.
Leela, Leela, sorry, I think it might have stuck on the "You Are Not a Guest" slide. So
Are
maybe,
you serious?
yeah,
Really?
sorry, I wasn't
No.
sure if you were going to show us the stuff after you talked, but maybe quickly take us through those slides so we can.
Well, I'm now trying to get out of. Okay, now I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues. There we go.
Don't worry, it's part of the course on Ladies to Comics.
Yeah, all right, that's weird. I'm so sorry, everybody. All this
No,
time
don't
I've just
worry.
been,
You can. We're nicely primed now to see all the images. You've got us
well,
like wetted.
that's terrible though. All right, let me see. What if I stop my share and then restart
Yeah,
it?
I think that's probably best. Yeah, let's try that.
Okay, I'm gonna try that again.
Okay, great. Now we can see one of your sketches.
Great, great. Oh my God. Okay, let's just go to full screen again. Make that easier for everybody.
Oh, no, I'm afraid it's come back to you.
How about now? Yes or no?
No, we can only see you at the moment.
Okay, I am not going to full screen then.
No, I think that's a
Okay.
good plan. Yeah, just go back to where you were. Yeah.
All right, can you see it now?
No, still
Okay,
see you.
I'm gonna unshare again.
That's a good plan. Yeah.
Actually, weird, it stopped sharing. Okay, when I went to full screen, it kicked me off of share.
Okay, yeah, we're back on your drawings now. Brilliant. Yeah, we can see them all.
Great,
Fantastic.
great, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the beginning so you can see what the heck I was talking about.
Wonderful, thank you. That's great.
Oh, sorry, everybody.
Someone says it might be a Mac and Zoom thing. Apparently
Maybe, yeah,
they
who
don't like each other
knows?
so much.
So I'm usually on the receiving end of screen shares. I don't do a ton of it myself. So you heard me say I'm translating some of these sketches into paintings,
Mm.
and you've heard me talk about these. So here is basically what I was talking about. Um, and that's the comic I was referring to when I was talking about making a comic for Bandcamp's Resonance column about a band called Come. Um, I'm sorry about the disparate sizes of the imagery. But like I was saying, there's still a lot of kind of unreality and surrealism in my paintings. Um, this is from a series called Sentinels. So this is not from the same fuck Earth, although this kind of thing might end up in it. Um, I also collaborated earlier this year with the musician Talia Zedek, who was actually the front person in the band Come. We did a residency together at a place called the Wedding Cake House here in Providence, Rhode Island, that is one of the best artist residencies I've ever been to. It's absolutely amazing. It was created by a feminist art collective here called the Dirt Palace, and I highly recommend checking them out. So Talia and I did this kind of very last minute seat of the pants improvised installation in the tower of the Wedding Cake House with my paintings kind of hanging throughout the room and her sound art playing in this. It's a massive Victorian mansion with this big turret that has 3 levels in it. So we were in the first level of it and you could hear the music sort of snaking up to the top of the tower. It was really cool. But to continue talking about the same fuck Earth, I was thinking about a particular time period in my life where these drawings were kind of coming out of, I want to say that they're memories, but some of them are fictional memories. They're not necessarily my memories. They're impressions. They're drawing on conversations I have with other people, with lives I didn't live necessarily. Sometimes I'll do something like draw without my contacts in and see what happens. So this is actually kind of kind of like a really cursed version of a real experience. Um, and that was the first drawing that ever came out of this kind of experiment of mine. Um, just the floor of a venue. That venue is supposed to be a place called TT's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that no longer exists. And just also just kind of really, I could see what was sort of coming out as I was drawing was a lot of thinking about being a woman, being a really young woman, dealing with a lot of just, you know, boys, basically like being a young straight woman in the mid 90s trying to deal with relationships and my own artistic ambition and kind of the places where one would get in the way of the other. Um, but like I said, a lot of these are not necessarily real experiences of mine. And I'm at the point now where I'm considering a book revolving around this world that I'm creating in these drawings with more comics in it. Um, and of course, that's not the only, these topics of my own youth are not the only things I'm thinking of. Um, but I think that you can sort of see a lot of different streams emerging, and I'm not sure yet which ones are all going to feed into this one project. The origin of the title, The Same Fuck Earth, is from a friend of ours named Travis Fristow, who was a writer, a musician, and a librarian, and a punk who knew everybody. Uh, we were really good friends with him in Gainesville, Florida, which is where this drawing is set. I was also thinking about friends' memories in Gainesville and sort of thinking about like, what if I had lived there instead of in Boston? What would my life experiences have been? And I started drawing those. Travis has been dead for a decade. And so the title is a bit of a tribute to him, but it's also something that we say to each other a lot when we're thinking of him. And the origin of this is that he was living in a group house in Gainesville, and I don't remember the exact details, but there was a guy who was slated to move in, and he just wanted to move his stuff in a few days before the moving date, and they wouldn't let him. And he left them this very impassioned note that ended with, in all caps, he wrote, "Do we not live on the same fuck earth?" And so now that's just like a household phrase. And this is me just kind of processing current reality. Was that it? No. Thinking
Yeah.
about being a cis girl in then and now. All right, I'm gonna unshare now.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to come and talk. This is very exciting. And that was just absolutely brilliant talk, Leela. I really loved it. And a lot of your influences really resonate with me as well, like the Hernandez brothers and the Weimar and all that, which probably doesn't really show in this piece, but anyway. Okay, so my comic is called Silver River, and it's based on the history of my family, who came from Dundee and worked in the jute industry. So what I'm going to do is just sort of go through the process that of like making the comic. So originally I was interested in, my great grandfather was killed in the First World War, and I started kind of being interested in that. And it was kind of like I grew up with all these stories about my family, but I didn't really pay any attention. I think, like lots of people, they were just kind of stories and they didn't really mean much, and they were just kind of background noise almost. And it was only recently that I started kind of I just suddenly started thinking about my great grandfather. He was killed at the age of 32 in leaving his wife and three very, very small daughters. And my great grandmother worked in the jute mills in Dundee at that time. And I just suddenly started thinking about it a lot more and imagining what their lives were like, and really trying to kind of think about it suddenly just made me realize they were actually real people that existed, and this happened to them, which just hadn't really occurred to me before, because I always had their stories secondhand through other people. So I just started really drawing images and thinking just images of the First World War and the war graves. And so my great aunt, who, as you'll see, kind of becomes the main character of the story, went to visit her father's grave and took photographs. And the war graves in Belgium were just this kind of fields of identical white graves, were just really just horrible. And then I started thinking about, so my great grandmother and her younger brother, at the age of 8 and 5, were orphaned and thrown out onto the streets of Glasgow. So they were living homeless. They were 8 and 5. And then they were taken into the poorhouse of Glasgow, which was, I mean, sort of unimaginably horrific place. And again, I just never really thought about it. And there was a story about my great grandmother, who was called Annie, escaping the poorhouse. She would run away and get taken back and is beaten. And just thinking about this little girl of 8 years old in a poorhouse, like escaping, I just thought, wow, she's trying to find her brother because they were separated. And it was just kind of really, you know, I'd never really thought about it before. So again, I started drawing kind of images, just sort of single images from what I knew about their lives. And so Annie, my great grandmother's daughter, who was my great aunt, it was very complicated. She was a very sort of big figure in my childhood. And so I started drawing just my memories of my great aunt Agnes when I was a child. And she was a lifetime member of the zoo for some reason. So we used to go to the zoo all the time and see Guy the gorilla. I don't know if anyone from London who's kind of my age might remember Guy the gorilla, who lived in the zoo for kind of, I don't know, I think like 30 years or something. So I just started drawing little kind of memories of things Agnes said. She was very sort of, she was quite a character. She used to sort of say quite kind of bizarre things. And my father, who was her nephew, they got on, they were very close, but they had this kind of fractious relationship, and they were always having these really stupid arguments about things. And so one of them that I've put in, I remembered, was Agnes saying, if ants were as big as people, they'd be more intelligent than us and take over the world. And my dad being like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. And they had this stupid argument that got really heated. And my sister and I would kind of sit there playing, listening to all this, and just loved it. We thought it was hilarious. And my great aunt Agnes, she absolutely loved her mother. She would talk about her mother all the time and what an amazing woman she was. And you know, as children, we were just like, you know, whatever. But I remember her talking, and of course her father died when she was 9 months old. And so she never had a relationship with him. She never knew him. But I remembered her saying once that she got hold of her birth certificate, and he had signed it, and he was present when the birth certificate was signed. So she knew that he'd held her as a baby. So I did a few sketches of her being held as a baby by her father, and just her knowing that gave her great comfort, you know. So even though she never met him, she had maybe 1 or 2 photographs, because he died in 1915. So she didn't really know what he looked like or what he sounded like, but she, you know, she had this feeling that he'd held her as a baby. And then as I got interested in this, I was telling my mum, and my mum said, oh, I've got Agnes's memoirs. And I was like, what? Why has nobody told me this? So she gave me Agnes's memoirs, which were just this exercise book. Agnes was a very prolific writer and artist. She used to write all sorts of poems. She went to the Islington Pensioners Forum Reminiscence Group when she was a pensioner, and she gave me their magazine when I was young, and I never read it, to my shame. I was like, oh, thank you, put it in a drawer, I never read it. So now coming back to it, I had her memoirs, I had her reminiscences from her magazine. And then after she died, we found this letter from a man that she'd had a relationship with, which was this incredible, like unbelievably passionate, painful letter, that it was a whole other side of Agnes that we didn't know about. So suddenly I had a huge amount of material for this story from and it became really something much bigger than I'd thought. And I did a lot of research. So I did a lot of research about the jute industry, working conditions at that time, what life was like for women. And obviously, like, we have the internet, which is great. So this is a photograph I found of factory workers in Dundee in 1910. So that would have been around the time that my great grandmother was working. And I just thought this was the absolutely most wonderful photo, because these women's lives were just so grueling and hard, just horrible, but they look so kind of happy, and the camaraderie, and just this great, I just love this photo. And I was also particularly interested in getting all the kind of the costume and hair right, because I've read a couple of graphic novels which have been set in certain time periods where the clothes and hair are completely wrong, and it could be like I saw one that was set in about this period, but everyone looked like they were from the 1960s, and so I did a lot of research into costume and hair, and that's just some more women who worked in the jute. This is another picture of jute mill workers around that time, and so they've got very distinctive hairstyles, and they all wore those blouses with kind of and I really thought about, they had quite heavy, probably woolen clothing, and what that was like sitting in a jute mill all day wearing this very, very heavy. I get really hot if I'm in anything more than a t-shirt a lot of the time, and the idea of having to be in a buttoned up thick blouse would be just so I did quite a lot of sketches and visual research, and the street that Agnes lived on as a child. So in her memoirs, she describes everything really vividly, and she described the house that she lived in as a child. And I actually found a picture of the street, and her description is very accurate. I could really recognize it from her description. And I did a lot of research into like the process of jute production, which probably happily didn't make it into the final piece. I'm not sure how many people would be that interested in the whole process of jute production, but I got really into it. It was actually, and all the uses of jute and the and so I came to a point where I had this like enormous amount of material and so many different strands of the story and all this kind of historical research, mentoring from Emma, which was really helpful in being able to kind of shape it a bit and kind of narrow it down. And also, I actually did this in the end for the LDComics online fair, and having a really tight deadline was brilliant, because I think otherwise I'd be doing it for the next 20 years. I could honestly, this is a never-ending story. There was like my dad's story, and I could have gone on, but luckily I had to be a bit focused. So the way I organized it was I used different colored index cards to because there was like different time periods. I had my memories as a child, I had Agnes's childhood, I had Annie, her mother's childhood, and then I wanted to have like some context about the jute industry, about, you know, just some sort of historical context. So I color coded it and put in kind of scenes and then organized it all like this, which was really helpful. And then I discovered you can also do this on Canva. So I had a Canva version as well, which is much probably better than sticking it on the wall. I quite liked it on the wall. I thought it looked quite good. And then in terms of materials, this is my little desk setup. I had pictures of Agnes as inspiration to spur me on. And I decided to use a color palette to differentiate the time period. So I had, I don't know if you can see, I've got Dr. P.H. Martin liquid watercolors, and I have sepia for Agnes's childhood and kind of violet, bluey gray for Annie's childhood, and more sort of full color for mine. And I read an interview with Chris Ware where he talks about using a non-photo blue pencil for drawing everything out and then fills it in. So I, like, you know, for no good reason really, I got myself a blue pencil and I drew it all out in blue pencil and then inked it and then did watercolor. So in the final, I've got one page where it's kind of a potted history of jute and the whole relationship with the whale industry, a little bit about the whale industry, which was key in the history of jute in Dundee. And one of the uses of jute was to make sandbags in the First World War. And I really kind of thought a lot about that because, you know, the jute mill owners in Dundee made an absolute fortune out of the First World War. And there was a 1 week period in 1915 where there was something like 150 million jute sacks were shipped to the front in 1 week, just in 1 week. And this was happening all throughout the war. And it just occurred to me that my great grandmother was working in the mills producing jute. And my great grandfather was in Belgium. And there was a possibility that, you know, when he was killed, he could have died on a jute sack that my grandmother had produced. And it just seemed there was a link between them through the jute sandbag. And I did a lot of research into jute sandbags and how they were filled. You know, they would have like a filling party of a team of 2 men who would just be like filling sandbags with earth, and they did something like 1 or 2 a minute, you know, just like horrendous, you know. This is so as a kind of framing. This is a map of, as you can see, London Underground, and it was kind of, I just wanted to, why am I living in London when my family come from Scotland? So I had a little kind of bit of a summary of why my dad came to London in the 1950s, around the same time Agnes, and that's why I was born in London. So this is just some of the illustrations from Agnes's childhood, from the memoirs. And one of the features of the memoirs is she writes, because she was very sort of arty and creative, and she goes into huge detail about all the sort of things they made out of necessity. So for instance, her mother would bring back kind of waste jute from the jute mills, and they'd spin the jute and crochet kind of slippers that they called huggers. And they would use old dresses and they'd sort of tear them up and make rag rugs. And then she describes them sitting around the fire, looking at the rugs, and that their entertainment was remembering all the clothes they'd worn while they were looking at the rugs, because you know they were made out, and they'd be, oh look, remember when we wore that. And then this is so this is the purplish palette for Annie's childhood, and this is and I thought a lot about the moment that Annie and her brother Tommy, who were 8 and 5, living in the streets, there must have been a moment when they were taken to be put in the poorhouse and separated. And so I wanted to kind of show that moment. And then Annie's in the poorhouse, and Tommy, she was in Glasgow, and Tommy was taken to Dundee. And they are eventually reunited, but you'll have to read my memoir to see to find out what happened. And then this image here is my sister and I, and my father, Agnes, grandmother, my grandfather, and all tell these stories all the time about their families and Dundee, and you know, and we just weren't really that interested. We were just kind of like, you know, we were in our own little children's world and not really kind of taking it all in. And of course now I wish I'd listened and, you know, paid more attention, but you know, none of them are here anymore, so I just have to kind of rely on my memory and my mum. But I mean, yeah, she only remembers so much, but it wasn't her family, so it's not quite the same. So it was, and what I found interesting actually was I started off thinking about my great grandparents, but more and more Agnes emerged as the main character, which kind of surprised me. And I think it's because, in a way, I'd always taken Agnes a bit for granted. You know, we were very fond of her, and she was a big part of my childhood. She was very, you know, I always kind of really loved her, and you know, I did appreciate her, but I don't think I appreciated her enough at all. And I think it was really, I really loved the way she kind of came out as a main character. And so that's why I've given her co-authorship on the cover, because really it was her, a lot of the words are directly from her memoirs. So, and it was beautifully written and really vivid and descriptive and, you know, alive. And I actually contacted the Dundee Verdant Museum, which is the Jute Mill Museum, and I'm going to donate the memoirs to them. So they're quite interested because there's so much detail. I think they're really quite keen to have them. So I'm going to, at some point, I'm going to go up to Dundee and give them, hand the memoirs over. But I just want to finish with a picture of, this is Agnes on the left as I remember her. And this is young Agnes as a nurse. She was the nurse in the Second World War, nursing soldiers in Dundee. So, and there's some lovely reminiscences in her reminiscence book about, you know, what it was like nursing in Dundee at that time. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much to Leela and Kat. So I'm going to be talking about how I also, similar to Kat, published my sort of first long format comic for the LDC online comic fair in July for their 15th anniversary. And I'm going to read, this is the cover page. So it's got in Punjabi at the top, Mera Indriya Naal Ki Hoya. And that basically says, what happened to my senses? So my graphic sort of narrative is about an exploration of what happened to my senses in my 2023 mental health crisis. I'm not going to speak specifically about the crisis itself, but I'm just going to talk about how I got from making and art making and to the format that you can buy via my website or come and find me at a fair somewhere. And at the bottom I've got in Punjabi as well, PR Kaur Gibbons. So if you say my name, you've basically read some Punjabi at the bottom. Yeah. So to get started, I'm just going to show you some of the spreads from my graphic narrative. So this is a spread, the opening spread for the sense of taste, and it says swathe. And as I go through these, I'll just explain that I'm going to talk about how I came up with the color choices, the paneling, and the structure, and how I ended up choosing the visuals. And this says sunwai, hearing, ged, or smell, chew, or touch, nazar, or sight, Shevi Bhavna, or the sixth sense. So there's a kind of bonus sense in the graphic narrative, and I'll explain how I came about that as well. So when I got invited by Emma to speak, I was like, I'm going to look at the back catalogue and see if there's anything in there that kind of connects to what I'm doing now. And I came across my little collage diary from 1994, and I'm 9 years old. And there's an entry in there which says, what I would like to achieve this term. I'd like to become a great artist, and I would like to draw countrysides and buildings. And just a bit of background, I teach in higher education, so I'm often getting students to come up with plans. So this feels very, very appropriate. And I'm going to come back to these two statements throughout my talk today. And jumping forward, 2002, I was doing fine art A-level, and yep, so I'm doing some countryside drawings. These are from a trip in Luxembourg in August and Austria, so family trips. So I got to do it as sort of part of my studies. But then fast forward to 2014, in between A-levels and undergraduate, I didn't really do what I wanted to do. So, I ended up changing course. So I ended up studying applied linguistics, teaching in English to international students. But in 2014, I taught out in Thailand, and I took a watercolor set with me. And that 9-year-old definitely got validated and seen, because I got to do a lot of painting and of buildings and countryside. And these, I don't have these anymore, because I made these as cards to send to family and friends. And I can't remember who actually had these, but yeah, it's quite nice to know that this art is out there somewhere. And then, so 2014 was also when I kind of was starting my master's in education. So things were changing kind of professionally for me. And then 2015, I'd finished my master's and I started attending LDComics when they were based in London. And I even did a blog post this is back in the day when we were face to face. And this is just the opening lines from one of those blog posts from 2017. Hi, I'm Kaur Gibbons, a comic enthusiast and a teacher of English to international students based in London. LDC at the Cartoon Museum was exciting as ever. And in true spirit, the question was something interesting or funny about your name or your favorite plant. So it's nice for me to think 10 years after this, I'm sort of connected in a different way. So fast forward to 2020, for various reasons, I started attending online workshops. A massive shout out to Wallace, Esther, Sean, Sharan, and anyone else who came to the Draw to Explores or hearing and speaking and so forth. And I started playing and having fun with pencil and the paper and not looking at the paper. So here are some 2 self-portraits that are from those sessions. And I also started attending more formal watercolor workshops as well, sort of learning to use the medium, and a lot of playtime as well. And then 2020, June, I decided to start my Instagram account at Stuff by Pam. And I was just sharing sort of what I was doing, and I call it playtime. So the bottom left, I really like the markings left using watercolors on masking tape. I kind of think of them as little landscapes. I did a lot of collaging in 2020. I had sort of an abundance of magazines and newspapers left by neighbors, and I couldn't just put them in the recycling. I wanted to do something with them. And then on the bottom right, these circle paintings, I called them bubbles at the time. This is quite important, and it kind of comes back again in my work later on. And then, yeah, classic Inktober 2020 was the first time I started doing that kind of daily challenges. Doodle Wash, which is a watercolor based one. So I did that in November and December. But my approach a lot with these daily challenges, I do a flurry in one go and then I post daily. I don't actually do the activities daily just because of life. But I also started to reconnect with Punjabi, and I'm going to just read the top line, which says, literally that says Kaur, coat, Ed Sabaj, which is fireworks, and Kumba for mushrooms. And then in 2021, in February, I came across an Instagram activity called 35 Days of Gurmukhi. Gurmukhi is the name for the Punjabi alphabet, and similar to other sort of daily Instagram accounts, events, each letter is sort of celebrated on Instagram. And this was my approach. And I was using these school books, and I kind of made it quite structured for me to reconnect with the script. And that was quite important. Because as a child, pre sort of secondary school, I could read and write the language. But secondary school life kind of took over and I kind of lost connection. And here's some more the Instagram-y kind of connected events. So in the one in June was Sketchy June. Started to fall in love with using a lot of color. I used sort of a pink and grey palette for Inktober, sort of trying to find a voice with it. And then January 2022, more Doodle Wash, so the watercolor challenge. And that's my little nod to the little 9-year-old self who wants to connect to countrysides. And then 2022, April, this kind of showcases me using stuff that I'd already made it. So I did these watercolor paintings, these striped lines, I call them sunshine paintings. And the way the alphabet is divided is into 7 rows. So I cut out each letter on a postcard, and that's the full Gurmukhi script there on the right and the blue. So that was really interesting for me to kind of reconnect with painting, drawing, etc. And then alongside all of this, I'm collaging and scrapbooking and just working through different things. And this is some of my sketchbooks. They're A4 in size. It's kind of a heavy cartridge paper, so ring bound, so that you can kind of fill them as much as possible. And the bottom right one is an example of what I'm working on right now, and that's just from August to date. And the reason I'm showing you these will come clearer when I talk about what happened to my senses and the making of that. And then January 2023, I returned to these circle paintings. This was just using like the leftover watercolor at the bottom of the water pot that I was using. And this was like at night time after I've taken my medication. I'm in quite a sedated state. And the space that this enabled me to sit in was really, really calming. And then I'm going to jump to July 2023. This is when my bipolar 2 hypomanic episode started, and it was horrific. It went on for months basically, and it should have only been a couple of weeks max. But my art making was exponential in that period. So this is just a little snapshot. So I was doing 5, 6, 7, 8 paintings at the same time. I was doing acrylics, pastels, collaging. The flat was sort of covered with, all the surfaces were covered with art making. But also during that time, I was signed off sick of work, but I attended as many local art workshops and art related clubs as possible. And I got invited to share some of my work at one of the local exhibitions. So January 2024, I had 3 pieces of work in a local exhibition. And yeah, that was a massive boost in confidence. So that 9-year-old is being seen again. And I think that's kind of important to recognize here. And then I had this boost of confidence. And then June 2024, LDC had this call out for their 50th anniversary, an online exhibition. And I thought, oh, maybe I can manage this, because I was nervous about tabling or going to fairs. I didn't have content, but I thought maybe this could help me produce something, and working to a deadline really, really worked. And thanks to that fair, I was like, okay, that website that I've been thinking about for the last year or so it came about. And sort of my strapline is art maker. So again, that 9-year-old is being validated. And part of my website, I kind of welcome you in Punjabi, which says Ji Ayanu. And there's a section on collage, drawing, painting, Punjabi script, zines. And I even have a color manifesto. And recently I've set up the event section. So I've started tabling and going to fairs, and that's really exciting for me. So as part of the LDC fair, I also had to do a self-portrait. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want it to be too formal. All that playtime in workshops and doing drawings of myself. I thought, what mediums do I like playing with? And I chose crayon to create this self-portrait. And I used, this is on newspaper print, which is A3 piece of paper. I do a lot of play on there. So I thought, let me use something that I'm not going to feel too precious about. And my hand is just there to kind of give you a scale of that. And it's quite nice to see my face at that size and that scale. So that's the kind of 9-year-old being met. And on the right-hand side is that was the working cover that I had at the time. And this was from a sketchbook that I used while I was sick in 2023. And then when it came to May, I was like, okay, I've got to start producing this. I had 2 sketchbooks, one for working out, and I just was play, explore, get into a flow state. That's definitely my vibe. And the collaging sketchbook, I chose one of those, a fresh one, to do my making and my designing in there, because that was a familiar space. And so when it came to making, I had this panel idea in my head. I had produced this in a workshop in 2022 with Wallace. It was when we were exploring a text about Frankenstein, and the visuals for the eyes really resonated with what happened to my sight, basically. But this column structure really stuck out for me. So I wanted to keep that in mind. And then this painting from a doodle wash, so the watercolor for the eyes. This is my explorations in that sketchbook for the eyes. Explorations for taste. So on the left, those are from Inktober's. So those visuals I remembered making those and I wanted to replicate them. They felt appropriate. Doodle wash, a painting of the nose. You can see my explorations got kind of not as wide because I was like, I knew what I wanted to produce. And then ears, and then in the middle here, this is me trying to figure out what I was going to do with those column panels. And I'm sure many of you here will know drawing hands is one of those difficult things. This was on the left is what I thought I would do, but I didn't like it. And then on the suggestion of my husband, just outline my hand, put it into a Word document, print it to the scale that I want, and then use that as an outline. And so these are the final visuals that I used. And I chose to do them not connected to anything, like not connected to a body, because there was such a disassociation almost, and I didn't feel connected to my senses. I was so overwhelmed during the actual episode. So those are the visuals there. And then I was like, what am I going to do with color? Because color is very important to me, hence the color manifesto on my website. And I use watercolor, like I mentioned, and I think, is it lines, is it marks? And then in that flow state, I decided, okay, I'm going to use one color for each sense. So I chose pink for sight, blue for smell, yellow for hearing, red for taste, green for touch, and then purple for the 6th sense as well. And I wanted to include pencil in my work because mark making is quite important to me. And on the right, you can see me kind of trying to figure out how to represent each sense through mark making. Just give you a moment to have a look at that. I'm going to move over. And then again, that column panel, I wanted to do that. And so I did everything on paper, and then I used Canva And I was quite scared about that. I'd never done anything digitally before. So this is me, what I did it on paper. So in that sketchbook, kind of ripped the pages out, painted the panels. And on the left is me starting, on the right is me going, okay, trying to sequence the colors. And this is sort of the order in which I sort of painted the different areas. And then this on the right became this. So at the top, I chose to put rows in so that I could incorporate Punjabi. But I wanted to incorporate some kind of disorientation. So when people read my work, they are met with that first row for each one, and then it goes into the column panels where there's text, and then the last section, which has got the mark making. So I'm calling those visual vignettes. So this is in a bit more detail. So this is how it started, and that's what I did. So the mirroring is to kind of create that disorientation, because my brain was, I'd kind of, during the episode, like Punjabi and English, I was mixing them up. So I kind of wanted to incorporate it in as much as possible. And so that was that one. And then, so this is where I put the text on the page. And then this is what I did in Canva. So I incorporated the Punjabi word on the left to kind of create this pattern. I'm just going to read what it says. My love for an apple a day became complex. The crisp sweetness that used to bring comfort was lost to the chaotic crunch that each bite brought with it. My world was changing. The loudness of eating echoed the loudness of the dark and unkind thoughts happening inside my head. And there is more text in the actual story, but I kind of didn't want to share all of it. And then on the right, my sense of taste became sensitive to spice. I felt grieved by this because of my love of Punjabi food, a deep connection to my heritage. So each sense has this kind of pattern. On the left, a bit more detail, and then on the right, a little vignette of what's happened to the sense, and then a kind of commentary on how I'm dealing with it. And then the visual vignette. So this is pencil on the watercolor, and you can see I've cut out the visuals for the sense. And then this is what happened in Canva. I put them into these panels, grids. And so this is kind of just to show you, the top row is what I did on paper in that sketchbook, and then the bottom row is what I did in Canva. And I basically repeat this for each sense. And when it came to the cover, the one I kind of originally thought I was going to use didn't feel right. And so I thought, let me return to something that I feel comfortable with. So circles. So I painted with watercolor 6 of each color, and I just loved what happened on the paper and the water and the kind of connections there. And this was meant to be a tester, but I decided to use it as it was. And then on the right is an example of me trying to see if I could use the cutouts on the page for the cover, but it didn't feel appropriate, felt too busy. So this is what the cover actually looks like in the digital download on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, with Canva, I changed the opacity and I use it as the background for kind of the explanations. And I deliberately in the contents page chose to not include translations and explanations because I wanted the reader to get a sense of disorientation, but hopefully once they figure out the pattern and the rhythm that I'm going through, that will become softer for them. And in the digital download, there's a glossary section, a cutout, some background and support and acknowledgements. And I wanted to share these kind of quotes from my friend Lynn. She said, I also like how you've cut the pages into quarters like you do with your zines, but then keep splitting and merging them into halves or a full page, which is such a good description because that is not what I was doing at the time, but it's definitely doing. And they've seen me do that quite a lot with zines. And then the order of the colors is also a really nice choice with how they get cooler as the narrative moves for you. So I'm just going to explain why I chose the colors. So the bottom, at the bottom is the Winsor and Newton paint swatches that I used, and that's the order that I did the painting in. But the order at the top is the order of the actual graphic work. And for me, red is because red represents rage, and there was so much rage at the beginning of my episode, and it was almost uncontrollable, but I did present with a lot of passion and love. And then yellow, I had so much excitement, and I was so enthusiastic. So yellow is connected to that with hope, but also it has a meaning of like confusion for me as well. So the red and the yellow kind of seem to get softer. And then blue, sorrow, tranquility, green, jealousy, growth and nature. Being in the park and being outside was very calming. Touching grass was very calming. So I really wanted to have that visual. And then pink, it represents sort of feelings of guilt, but I presented with a lot of joy during the episode as well. And pink is one of my favorite colors, so I wanted to incorporate that towards the end. And then purple for the sixth sense and kind of representing anxiety and kindness, because I did come across as very sort of kind, but also very anxious during my episode. And I connect purple to sensations in the body. So that was quite important to include that. And so going back to that 9-year-old, I'd like to become a great artist. I think that I'm having a great time art making, and I'm very appreciative of the LDC platform that's kind of enabled me to be in that space. And I do draw countrysides and buildings quite often, but I just do that not so much in a public space, and it sits in little notebooks and sketchbooks, so that I'm happy with that. And just a massive kind of step after all of this, and thank you to Kat and Cherish York. Some of you might know, I tabled recently, first time selling my zines and a mini abridged version of my What Happened to My Senses, which is a zine. So having 6 senses works really, really well with a zine format, and it includes the small text vignettes and then some of the Punjabi and the visuals. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to check the chat now for any questions.